Okay. This governance work session is open, and the first order of business is to review the Facilities and Transportation Operational Expectations Report. What I'm going to suggest is that we put this aside because, as we know, we've got the strategic plan. We are basically eliminating the OEs, and so to my mind, it doesn't really make sense for us to review this OE at this point. So could I have consensus to not review this at this time? Show of hands? Okay. Thank you. Well, that's item number one. If we now go, we have 3 items on our agenda. The first one is the school board retreat. I hope all of you have had an opportunity to look at our schedule for okay, but we've already voted, so we've already reached consensus. All right, Ms. McLaughlin. All right.
So my follow-up question is, it's fine that we just voted, just eliminate it because of the strategic plan, but for those who are even just watching this work session, I think it would be helpful to then say what's going in its place. I mean,
that's something that the governance committee actually has on its next agenda, to look at both the elimination of the OEs and what replaces it and what needs to go into the strategic plan as a result of these changes. So this is going to come back to the board via the governance committee.
No, I understand that, but we just did an annual monitoring report. So if by saying now it's eliminated, it would be helpful to get an idea of, so what happens a year from now? Okay. Is that we don't know?
May I very quickly answer
Sure,
this?
Absolutely.
Okay. You'll remember that the board spent a number of different days. It wasn't just one. It was a number of different days where Hank Gamitro and others and our team walked us through. We looked at our current OEs. We looked at our student achievement goals, and then we looked at the metrics that were in the plan. And what we did was we asked for board members to identify anything that was an OE, those metrics in the OE, or anything in the student achievement goals that need to be included within the plan. And you all, I spent quite a bit of time doing that. And so we migrated a lot of those that you felt like were really important for the board to have a report on an annual basis into the strategic plan. And so at the back of that, you'll also remember that we talked about 4 major reports that you'll receive next year. There will be 3 board meetings for each of those 4. And then at every year, you'll determine whether or not we need to add anything else to the report. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't ask for any bit of this information that you think is important, or you're interested in, or if there's something comes up that's not reflected in the current strategic plan that you want to report on. So it doesn't preclude the board from asking for anything that's not in the actual strategic plan.
All right. So the next thing is the governance retreat. Does anyone have any questions or concerns about the schedule for the Saturday retreat? Okay. Ms.
My question is, do we know how many board members are attending?
Okay, I think there are 2 people who were not going to be able to attend. Anybody here, and I should tell you that I'm not sure how long I'm going to be able to be there because my husband's having back surgery on Friday. So Ms. Smith is ready to launch the retreat in my absence if I can't be there at 8 or 8:30 if I'm picking my husband up at the hospital. Ms. Strauss.
I will be leaving at the break at 2 to 2:15.
Okay.
So I will be able to stay until then.
Anybody else who either can't make it? I think Ms. McLaughlin, you're not going to be able to make it. Anybody else who's going to be Ms. Hines?
Well, I just have to take a quick break in the middle, or like from 11 to 12, and then I'll be back. So.
Okay.
And how long do you foresee going, actually?
Probably till 4. You know, it's 8:30 to 4.
Then I will probably be scooting out at least 30 minutes early.
Okay. Mrs. Smith?
This is getting bad.
People are going to be coming and going. We got some fluidity here.
I might need to leave by 2:30.
Okay. Anyone else? Mr. Moon, did you want to declare yourself?
I'm leaving at 4 o'clock.
Okay, good. So you're going to be there for the whole thing, Ms. McLaughlin.
so my request, because our retreats aren't recorded, And there are situations where board members have family matters and other commitments where we're not there. But as Dr. Garza pointed out, even like with the discussion the board had on the strategic plan, the OEs, I mean, if you weren't at that retreat, how do you even get a summary of the conversation? So I think it would be very important that the school board office make a commitment that somebody needs to be having a summary of each of the sections. Then board members can read the summary, and if they want to get more details after that. But important things can occur at the retreat, and if there's no avenue for board members to get that information, it can be problematic.
Okay, and I guess I would turn to Mrs. Goddard on that. I know you do take notes. Would that be possible for you to provide? Okay, that's fine. And so we will try to, keep good notes and have that available for those who can't attend or who can't attend for the full time. Did you have a question, Mr. No? Okay, anything else? Oh, Mrs. Reed?
So I'll just once again reiterate my perennial concern, and that is that a retreat is most effective when all board members are in attendance. So I understand that everybody has reasons why they can't come, but some of these discussions, I think, would be, obviously more productive if we were all there to discuss it together. So it's unfortunate. I mean, I'm not suggesting postponing it or anything like that, but it's unfortunate.
And I would say we actually did see if there were other dates that we could go to where more could attend, and other dates in July, just there wasn't going to be more attendance there. Mr. McElveen?
So mine is not about scheduling, but content. Should we deal with scheduling stuff first, or should? Okay, so my concerns about the content are ones that I've raised over the past at least 9 months or so, that I was hoping we would have an opportunity to have a in-depth discussion, potentially discussing the state funding and our ability to gain more of it, whether through legal or other means. And I was hoping that would be part of our summer retreat because of the timeline that we would have to move, not only with our legislative priorities, but with the upcoming General Assembly session.
Mrs. Smith?
I find it frustrating to have a discussion about something that's going to happen Saturday today. Typically when we do this, we've kind of said it and we've moved forward, because to change the agenda now is too difficult. I would say if that's your advocacy, Brian, that we need to figure out another time to talk about it. But this has been set up and organized.
My only concern is it's been my advocacy for the past nine months. So.
And we did add back in the piece about the school board advocacy on assessment and accountability, because that we originally had taken that off, but we decided that was a timely discussion that going into the fall and winter, that we needed to have that at our retreat. Dr. Garza, did you want to talk anything about what you're going to be bringing to us, or just wait until Saturday?
Yes, Dr. Lockhart and I are prepared to talk about the governance committee. I think has been reflecting the desires of the board and have asked for us to talk about state and local graduation requirements. I think this conversation is a precursor to some of the work that I know we've talked about around shaping some of the state policies around one pathway to a high school diploma. But I think it sets the stage for us to also understand from a policy perspective, what we're currently requiring that goes beyond what the state requires for the different diplomas. So that'll be part of the discussion, and we'll have a couple of key questions we'll be asking you about. And then the piece on assessment and accountability, we sent some pre-reading, I think, on Thursday. And that is, it was our understanding that the board would like a little bit more specificity as we talk about positions moving forward in the area of accountability. What do we think an effective accountability system what are those components of that, some kind of policy statements, if you will. And then also with assessment, we have, I think, a pretty comprehensive legislative plan, but what do we want the assessment to look like moving into the future? So Steve and I prepared to talk about that, lead that discussion. We have some definitions for you. We sent the Texas Visioning document because honestly it was kind of the best we've seen out there, where a group of people, educators, leaders, have really given some thought to that. And then we've taken a stab at developing a working draft of maybe some policy statements or position statements on assessment and accountability just to get us started. But we hope to have a good working draft of that we can continue to refine throughout the fall, that we could use prior to and certainly in the next convening of the General Assembly. Is that okay?
Ms. McLaughlin, did you have something else? No. Okay.
Well, yeah, I going on what was stated earlier by Ms. Reed, looking at the agenda, I see at 2:15 is when the board self-evaluation is. And I guess I would just say for the board members who are there, if you find that you're going to be below 6 to 8 board members, then I would wonder whether or not you want to reschedule that portion and have it done at a different time. I mean, even have half the board gone. I think that's actually one of the most important things we do as a board annually. And if you've, only half your board members there, then I think it's something to consider. And I'll leave it for all of you at the retreat to decide. If you think we don't have the critical mass, then maybe that's not when you conduct it.
All right. Thank you. So moving on to the Governance Committee's recommendation on the draft timeline for the school board revisions to the School Board Advisory Committee. And you'll see what we've done here is none of this is substantive suggestions. It's not suggestions for change. It's just a timeline on how we will consider potential changes to our advisory committees. So I would be looking today for consensus that this is a reasonable timeline for us to be looking at this issue, or any concerns or questions or recommendations for a different timeline. Any comments or questions? Or Ms. McLaughlin?
Just clarification. So what I think I see from here is if the board were to decide that they wanted to do some changes, then that would continue this timeline in place so that by July 2016, we would have the new framework.
Correct. And you'll see that with starting with December, it says this is what we would be doing if the board decides that we should make changes. If the board decides it doesn't want any changes at all, then the timeline stops.
So this was, I think, the catch-22 that we talked about in governance. So we're going to have a new sitting board in January. So we vote on something in December, and depending on the new board composition, they may end up saying, well, thanks for voting on something weeks before the new board gets seated, but we don't really agree with the structure you had in place, and we do think that some changes need to happen. So do we run the risk that the board's going to be, the old board votes in December and the new board? Under this timeline, we would be looking at any governance recommendations at a work session in March, and then it would come up in April. Right. So thank you, Ms. Evans and Ms. Smith, because that was the point of my question. Because Ms. Evans, you said something about in December we would decide, and it's really we're not deciding in December. We're going to be
if this board decided we didn't want to make any changes in the advisory committees at all, then this timeline would stop. That doesn't mean that when the new board comes in, it couldn't restart it then.
So it goes back to my question again, then, for clarity's sake, the sitting board is going to vote whether it wants to make any changes or keep what we have in place, correct? So if the sitting board says in December, thanks for the recommendations, nope, we're done, timeline stops now. Then the new board comes in January and says, well, different composition of people, and they actually now want to move forward with this timeline.
The new board will be able to do what it wants to do.
I wanted to make everybody mindful that we're going to make a decision in December that could then potentially come right back up again a few weeks later.
Any other questions or issues, Mr. Stork?
Mine is related to this because one of my concerns has always been how we follow up on the reports that are provided to us. And we had a conversation, I think in the June or July, the June work session, talking about the follow-up. Obviously, staff will be making their comments to the advisory committee recommendations in the board. Overall, we've looked at typically September, October. The board then says, okay, we're fine, or no, look at this or that. So I think it's important as part of what you're doing there that you tie into that, the existing process, because that might help us to discuss whether or not we think the current the current system is effective. You're not following me, I don't think. So we've got right now we have a system whereby the advisory committees report to us in June. They issue a report. The report goes to staff. Staff looks at that. Superintendent comes back and says, sometime in my mind, late August, early September, says, here's what we think of what the advisory committees recommended in terms of responses to particular items or even recommendations about how to maybe move something forward that's a policy issue. If it's an operation issue, the superintendent can do whatever she thinks is appropriate. If it's a policy issue, that then comes to us in September. And typically either in September work session or no later than the October work session, the board would essentially have a final kind of input on the advisory committee recommendations from June to say something should change or we should look at changing something or we're done and thank you and just keep working on the current charge that you have for this year, advisory committees. So tying into your timeline up there, I think would be appropriate to have these advisory committee recommendations from June as part of this, because I think part of what we all recognize is that we don't have enough time, number one. Number two, though, we have advisory committees that we want to respect the work that they've done, and we want to make sure that we've properly assessed them and or followed up on, meaning to say, yeah, we should do that, or no, we're not going to do that.
So, Mr. Stork, is your advocacy that we add something in here for October to say, should we draft something up? Okay.
But happy to have a discussion
if your advocacy is that we add something that says in October we will, this board will review staff recommendations based on the advisory committee reports. Is that your advocacy that we add this in there?
I don't need to advocate it because it's already part of our process. But
right.
What I'm asking is that
so you're saying we will
I think
do
it's
that.
a great time to. I think we're going to be having some of this conversation as a board in September, October, once we get the superintendent's recommendations on these advisory committee reports, and it may make sense to have some of that discussion part of that process. So it's because it will. I mean, we're going to be talking about the advisory committees in general then regardless. Maybe we don't have to do the full-fledged kind of yay or nay step process that you have here. I get that, but at least I think there'll clearly be a path that'll clearly lead us to the path of potentially a November conversation about what we're doing and ultimately, I guess, a December final decision on, at least for this board's decision.
And what I would say is that nothing in here would change or preclude what you're talking about. If you want it to be specifically stated, I don't object to that, but Mrs. Smith, did you have a comment on that?
I think we're mixing apples and oranges.
We are. But I think there's a nice, nice fruit medley that I think we would enjoy.
I think that
and
we're complicating this. This is just a timeline to make a decision about how we're going to deal with the advisory committees. I think part of that process needs to be an understanding of how the whole process works, the board's time, where we're effective, where we're not effective. That's all part of it. I think the issue that you bring up is a totally separate issue. I don't want to see this process to review the advisory committees mingled with that. I agree with you. We haven't been satisfied with the processes. We've had to deal with this. But I don't think you add that to this timeline.
May I finish the dialogue on this? I understand Kathy's point, but we will, regardless of what we say now, and we can say that we're not going to do this, that we will have a dialogue about this when the superintendent makes her recommendations, because we will talk about, are we honoring what the advisory committee's work was or wasn't, what they did, and we will talk once again about, is this the most effective process that we should follow for this? So don't say we're not going to talk about it, but we are going to talk about it, because that will be what we do. So I just say, and I think to put it in here and acknowledge that that's what we're going to be doing would be valuable. Frankly, put in not, but I think it's just a way of looking at this broader picture that we're going to be looking at. Thank you.
Il Young?
Thank you, Ms. Evans. May I suggest that at the next governance committee meeting, that this particular issue be discussed and brought back to the full board at a work session, regularly scheduled work session for recommendation to how to address the recommendations coming from advisory committees through their reports, how we respond to that. There have been different ways of responding to our recommendations from advisory committees in the past, but we have not always followed through the process. So it might be worthwhile the governance committee to come up, discuss it, and come with a formal recommendations
On this particular issue?
On this particular issue.
And so so put this aside for today and refer it back to governance?
Right, correct.
All right. Ms. McLaughlin?
I have a hybrid suggestion. I agree with Mr. Moon. Having served on governance the last 2 years, this issue has languished on the agenda, and some of our advisory committee veterans have been very frustrated, wondering why we haven't answered as a board how we're going to be more effective and proactive in that. So I would suggest we go with both Mr. Moon and Mr. Stork's recommendation. Mr. Stork's was very high level. It's simply acknowledging, just like on this timeline, in July, what did we do? Strategic plan approved by the school board. Advisory committee charges were approved. October, school board will review staff response to the advisory committee. It doesn't have to say how we're doing it in October. That, I do agree with Mr. Moon, should go back to governance with recommended ways. But it is not apples to oranges. I see it differently from my colleague. We're trying to help the public understand, as much as the board itself understand, how are we moving through this in a methodical way. And simply listing October 2015 is when the board's going to be reviewing the current staff responses to it. And at that point, the board will, whether it's through a work session or otherwise, is going to have the conversation about the present structure.
All right, let me get a sense of the board on this. We have an advocacy from Mr. Stork to take note of the fact that the superintendent and staff will be responding to advisory committee reports in approximately the October timeframe. Mr. Moon is suggesting that this go back to the governance committee to consider that suggestion. So we could have
Ms. Evans.
Yes.
I'm happy to accept Mrs. McLaughlin's suggestions to put it on, but have a committee discuss for the further detail.
And I thought that's what you were recommending initially, to have it go back to governance.
Even just a noting on this timeline, that's fine. I mean, it's
Leave today knowing we're going to list October 2015.
Okay.
that is fine.
And does that really need to go back to governance? You're thinking that needs to go back to governance to do that?
How to do it?
How to do
Probably
it.
will have to be discussed.
All right, so let me get a sense of the board of whether we will re-refer this to governance with the understanding that governance will add that note back into the timeline. How many people would like to do that? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, that's a majority. So this Is there anything else that anyone, other than the October piece, anything else anyone would like to say about this when it goes back to governance? No? Okay. Well, that will be re-referred to governance for further work. So the last thing we have on our governance work session is, you'll recall that the Title I Advisory Committee came to us with recommendations on changes that they wanted to see in the language in the Strategic Governance Manual. And what you're seeing here is both the agenda item that is coming up for a vote at our next regular board meeting, and you also can see a strike through of what the changes, how the changes would look in the Strategic Governance Manual. So this is an opportunity to have further discussion about this if there was further discussion about these proposed changes. Yes, Ms. Hines.
Yeah, I've been the liaison to that committee this year, and I was there when they discussed it, and I just think it makes a lot of sense to make these changes. It won't change what they do. It's just sort of how they present themselves to the community. So,
excellent. Mrs. Strauss? Okay. Any other comment or conversation on that? All right, seeing none, this governance work session is adjourned.
2-minute break. Run. We'll make sure nobody pushes you from behind.